Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
Haha. Working over your rifle, I see. Well, that's the way. It's a soldier's best friend. You be good to it, and it'll always be good to you.
Yes, sir.
Well, good luck to you, soldier. Carry on.
And now it's my great honor to present Dr. Steven Pinker.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's always a great thrill to come back to the Coolidge Corner Theatre. I've been coming here since 1977, long enough to remember when the balcony really was a balcony. And I spent many a pleasant summer night here, not least because it was air-conditioned. As Cheryl mentioned, the film we're going to see tonight is an anti-war film, one of 135 that Wikipedia lists, and of which the top 10 in a number of lists invariably mention Dr. Strangelove, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, Paths of Glory, The Great Dictator, The Deer Hunter, Platoon, All Quiet on the Western Front, MASH, and Gallipoli. 3 of the 10 were directed by Stanley Kubrick, the director of Paths of Glory, which comes in number 4th in many of these lists. Now, the whole category of an anti-war film raises profound psychological questions on the nature of human violence and our capacity to control it. What is the point of an anti-war film if not to hold out the hope that by influencing audiences we can reduce the temptations toward war? Indeed, it raises one of the most profound questions that we can ask about human nature, namely, does human nature doom us to endless war? And there are certainly some reasons for pessimism. That is, reasons why human nature seems to incorporate some tendencies that can erupt in systematic violence. Our evolutionary cousins, the other great apes, are experts in a number of categories of violence. Anthropologists who conduct cross-cultural surveys have noted that homicide, rape, and coalitional aggression, that is, groups of men getting together to commit aggression for some common goal resulting in raiding and feuding, seem to be universal across societies. The most violent age in life, what would you guess that to be? Most people would say maybe 15 to 30. In fact, the answer is the age of 2. The reason we don't think of 2-year-olds as particularly violent is that we don't let them have access to guns. They can't do a lot of damage, so we don't arrest them. But if you actually tabulate acts of violence, you find that violence emerges without much prompting in 2-year-olds. Examination of the brains of mammals, including a certain featherless biped, reveals that we have circuits in the brain that underlie enraged attacks, and circuits that seem to underlie a thirst for dominance, to climb the pecking order and become alpha. And these are circuits that tend to be juiced up by the presence of testosterone. All of us tend to get enormous pleasure in thinking about and watching violence. I think this theater, among others, would not survive if we didn't take enormous pleasure in watching bloodshed and mayhem, including murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And topping off the list is an intriguing set of studies showing that even people who don't commit acts of violence in their life seem to be prepared for it. Social psychologists have asked people the following question: have you ever fantasized about killing someone? The answers are revealing. About 15% of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And about 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people. What does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that 25% of men are liars. Well, given this age-old evidence that humans seem to be prepared for violence, one arises at a quite natural historical prediction that as weaponry and military organization improve, humans will wreak ever-increasing destruction. a prediction that seems to have been borne out by the events of World War I beginning almost exactly 100 years ago. World War I resulted in 8.6 million battle deaths. That's soldiers killed on the battlefield and civilians caught in the crossfire. Perhaps 15 million deaths in all if we count the number of people who died of disease and starvation in the wake of the war. It's the 13th worst man-made disaster in history. It introduced the world to carnage on an unprecedented scale because of the damage that can be inflicted by tanks, planes, poison gas, an entirely new category of weaponry, and trench warfare. It ended 4 imperial monarchies: Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, which left a power vacuum filled by the Nazis in Germany and the Soviets in Russia, who then fought it out all over again in World War II. So this was a big, fat, consequential event in human history, destruction on what seemed like an unprecedented scale. The implications for an understanding of human nature did not go unnoticed. Probably the most extreme version of this is the idea that all of us house a death drive, a death instinct, Thanatos, a concept introduced by Sigmund Freud in his books Beyond the Pleasure Principle, The Ego and the Id, Civilization and Its Discontents, all of which have dates well after the invention of psychoanalysis as a theory in psychology, clearly developments following the enormous shock of World War I. Well, here we are 100 years later, and if we really do have these instincts for aggression, if we do have a Thanatos, a death wish, what has the world seen in the 100 years since? Well, here is a big and rather pleasant surprise that this is an era that a number of historians and political scientists have called the long peace. The fact that since 1946, the world has seen a historically unprecedented and completely unpredicted decline in interstate war. That is, wars with a government on each side. There are a number of data on this period that I will mention, but the most interesting number from this period since 1946 is 0. This is the era which saw 0 wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, despite every expert prediction that a World War III between the US and USSR was inevitable. USSR went out of existence and it never happened. Contrary to every expert prediction, no nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. There have been no wars between any 2 great powers since the end of the Korean War, more than half a century ago. No 2 wars between any Western European countries. Nowadays, it would almost seem comical to raise the question, raise the possibility of a war between France and Germany. Oh, that's just inconceivable. But needless to say, this is not the way things used to be, as we will see in the film tonight. Germany and France were pretty much at each other's throats for several thousand years. Indeed, before 1945, Western European countries alone began 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1946, that went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. Rich countries don't fight each other anymore. This almost seems obvious. We think of wars as things that take place in some of the poorer and more backward corners of the earth. But for most of human history, it was the rich countries that were constantly at each other's throats. And because rich countries can afford big, rich, destructive armies, they can do an awful lot of damage. Well, this leads more generally, this fact noted by historians just qualitatively, based on what did not happen, to a new and I think very exciting branch of science, namely the science of war and peace. War nerds who count the number of wars in different categories, count the number of deaths in the different wars, plot them over time, and test hypotheses about cause and effect. Looking at the data, being a quant about it, playing Moneyball with history, can you test hypotheses about what leads people to fight wars or not to fight wars? So here's an example of what you see when you graph the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st in terms of the death toll. You see that there were 2 unmistakable spikes of bloodshed corresponding to World War I and World War II, But then a funny thing happens. While everyone predicted World War I, World War II, well, World War III, that's going to be fought with nuclear weapons. That's going to put World War I and World War II to shame. The curve should keep going up. Here we've been seeing this kind of wrinkled carpet clinging to the floor of the graph, the period called the Long Peace. I'm going to actually now zoom in on the period beginning in 1946 and show you what that curve looks like when you look at it close up, but now divided into 4 different categories of war. Here we have the rate of death from colonial wars, which tapered off to 0 by the mid-1970s. Here we have interstate wars, that is a war of a country against another country, with spikes corresponding to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq War. Here you've got the death toll from civil wars, and here you have them from internationalized civil wars, that is, civil wars where some other country butts in, usually on the side of the government. So you have a kind of roller coaster trajectory, but one with an unmistakably downward overall trend. And here we are in the 21st century with a unprecedentedly thin laminate of layers corresponding to the low rate of death in war that we have been enjoying in this century. Now this graph goes up to 2008. That was the last year for which data were available when I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature. But since then, the databases have been updated, and we can factor in the increase in carnage that we have seen in Syria and Libya and other consequences of the Arab Spring. So if you update it to 2012, you see that there is indeed an uptick in the rate of death in war, mainly corresponding to Syria, but it doesn't come anywhere close to reversing the overall decline in war deaths that the world has seen since 1946. So let me now interpret those data for you more qualitatively. How could this have happened, given what we read about in the papers seemingly every day? So as I've mentioned, there have been fewer interstate wars, country against country. There have been, admittedly, more civil wars as newly independent states, especially in the 1960s, with inept governments defended themselves against insurgent movements, with both sides egged on and financed by the Cold War superpowers. But interestingly, after the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, the number of civil wars declined as well. And crucially, civil wars, when you count, kill far fewer people than interstate wars. There's nothing like a pair of leviathans chucking artillery shells at each other, bombing each other's cities, massing huge armies of tanks that face each other in the battlefield to rack up high death rates in a hurry. Even the worst civil wars tend not to have body counts as high as one government fighting another. So again, just to make these numbers a little more real by looking at particular cases and to bring it back to the subject matter of tonight's film. World War I, the setting for tonight's film, probably killed 15 million people in all, directly and indirectly. The Battle of the Somme alone killed 20,000 people in one day and 300,000 people in 4 months. These are almost incomprehensible figures by the scale of deaths in wars today. Korean War, 3 million deaths. Vietnam War, 2 to 3 million. Iran-Iraq War, a kind of the Islamic world decided that they should have a World War I too, and so they had massive tank battles and artillery bombardments, killed 1 million people as recently as the 1980s. You compare them to this is the kind of war that has gone out of style. Compare them to the civil wars, which is what we tend to read about nowadays. Even the worst of them, Iraq had 185,000 deaths. That's still an unspeakable tragedy, but it is an order of magnitude or more less than the old-fashioned wars that pitted one government against another. And the worst ongoing war now is Syria. 150,000 is a blood-curdling number, but we've got to remember that not so long ago we had wars that killed in the millions rather than in the tens of thousands. Again, I'll throw out some figures just about the United States. The United States lost 116,000 soldiers in World War I and 400,000 in World War II, 36,000 in Korea, 58,000 in Vietnam. In Iraq, the subject of so much of our concern, there have been 4,500 and another 2,200 in Afghanistan. Again, each one of them a tragedy, but there are an order of magnitude fewer tragedies than there were not so long ago. And the United States, like most countries today, operates under a syndrome variously called casualty dread, war aversion, or the Dover Doctrine, the idea that you prevent at all costs lots of flag-draped coffins from coming back to Dover Air Force Base. Now this is, at first seems completely incredible until you realize that stranger things have happened. That in The Better Angels of Our Nature, I document that the decline in war is just one of 6 major historical declines of violence. Declines that are largely invisible to us because of an interesting feature of our psychology, combined with an operative feature of our news media. We all know that the news media operate under the watchword, if it bleeds, it leads. We enjoy violence in our entertainment, as I mentioned earlier, and we are entertained by violence in the news. And so wherever something blows up, whenever some jerk gets a gun and kills people, that will make page 1. All of the parts of the world where nothing has blown up, or all the schools where no one has gone on a rampage, you never see a reporter in front of that school or at that city saying, nothing has happened here today. News is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. As long as the rate of violence has not fallen to 0, there will always be enough violent incidents to fill the news, which can, particularly as the news media get better and better at covering violence. For that matter, it doesn't even have to be the news media. There are more than 1 billion smartphones circulating around the world. Now, anyone with a smartphone is a real-time reporter. You can beam color footage of a violent act anywhere it occurs in the world in real time. You combine that media dynamic with a feature of our cognitive psychology called the availability heuristic. This is a term coined by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Some of you may have read Kahneman's bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. The availability heuristic is a feature of our psychology that governs how we assess risk. How dangerous is the world, or how dangerous is a particular setting? And the answer is we tend to answer that question by thinking of vivid events. If you can recall something from memory, because it's stuck in memory, you think that there's a lot of it, even though it might reflect nothing more than what sticks in your own memory. Now, scenes of things blowing up or carnage burn themselves into our memory, and so we are apt to overestimate how frequent they are because of the way we assess risk. And then there's a third factor, which is a feature not of our cognitive psychology, but of our moral psychology, which is that we care more and more about a larger and larger circle of people. Events that in a few decades ago would not have counted as news because no one really cared what happened in a remote part of Timor or Africa, we now feel are our concern, and we can get as upset about them as if they occurred among people that are socially and physically closer to us. Well, this raises the question of why violence has declined, the most conspicuous example being the decline of war since 1945. It's unlikely that human nature itself has changed. Since 1946, there have only been about 2 generations. That is far too slow for Darwinian natural selection to have had an effect. Some of the declines are even more recent, such as the decline in civil war since the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s. However, what we need in order to address this paradox is a more inclusive, richer, more nuanced conception of human nature. Namely, human nature is and always has been extraordinarily complex, and it has always included both the inclinations toward violence that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but also inclinations that counteract them. The brain is a big place, there's a lot going on in there, and even if we have impulses that can erupt in violence, that's not all we have. We also have parts of circuits in the brain that can clamp down on those inhibitions, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. And a fruitful way to understand what has happened since 1946 is that historical circumstances have increasingly favored the peaceable parts of human nature over the more violent parts. Well, what are these parts? Let me just go through a candidate list pretty quickly. There's, among the motivations that we have for committing acts of aggression, there is pure exploitation, the harming of a person that happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want. And that can result in forms of violence like rape, plunder, conquest, and eliminating inconvenient rivals. There's an entirely different category of violence due to contests for dominance, the striving among individuals to climb the pecking order and become alpha male, and a corresponding very odd urge among groups of people for a kind of pecking order among groups. You want your ethnic group, your race, your nation, your religion to be supreme over its rivals. A third category of violence is moralistic violence, or revenge. The idea that it is not just permissible, but it is mandatory to inflict harm on someone who has committed some moral infraction, resulting in vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. Well, that all sounds pretty depressing. So what do we have on the other side? What are the better angels of our nature? There's self-control, the idea that you should count to 10 before erupting in violence and anticipate the consequences of your behavior. These, we have reason to believe, are embodied in circuitry in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. There's empathy, circuits that are encouraged by oxytocin that allow us to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that govern just what a decent person just does or doesn't do and doesn't even occur to them to do if they consider themselves to be a part of a respectable member of a community. You just don't wipe your nose on your sleeve in polite company if you want to be respected by your peers. And then there's reason, cognitive processes that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis to treat violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. So the question now is, how do you bring the psychology together with the history? What are the historical developments that bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can commit acts of bloodshed? Or in this context, in particular, what caused the long peace? What caused the decline of interstate war since 1946? Now, the most popular theory that people suggest to me as soon as they encounter this fact is the idea that because of nuclear weapons, we've been scared straight. There's one political scientist who argued that the nuclear bomb should be given the Nobel Peace Prize. I think that this is extremely unlikely. For one thing, nuclear weapons are militarily pretty much useless other than to deter an all-out attack because they are so massively disproportionate to any threat. And for that reason, nations have been operating under a kind of norm that has been called the nuclear taboo. That is, you just don't bring out your nukes, even the small so-called tactical nuclear weapons. As a result, nations know that nuclear nations aren't going to unsheath their nuclear weapons for anything but an existential threat of annihilation. And so repeatedly, you have non-nuclear nations threatening nuclear ones, exactly the situation that should not occur if there was such a thing as nuclear deterrence. There was a 4-year period in which the United States had a nuclear monopoly before the Soviet Union developed its own nukes. Did that mean we could just get whatever we wanted on the world stage and no one dared defy us? This was the year of the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. They were confident that we would not reply with a nuclear attack on Moscow. The United States, in fact, has repeatedly been defied by non-nuclear states, such as North Vietnam and Iraq twice. Sadat invaded Israel-held Sinai, knowing that Israel would not render Cairo a radioactive crater. Afghanistan defied first the Soviet Union, then the United States. Argentina took over the Falklands at a period in which the UK had nukes and they did not. And finally, there's the obvious fact that conventional deterrence gives you plenty of reason to think twice about starting a war. That World War II in Europe, for that matter World War I, showed that a conventional war could do such unthinkable damage that the additional damage done by the threat of a nuclear weapon probably was not the decisive factor. No one wanted a repeat of World War II, even in Europe. A second theory is sometimes called the liberal peace, and it's based on a theory by Immanuel Kant that the rise, in an essay called Perpetual Peace that he published more than 200 years ago, that democracy, trade, and an international community would all disincentivize leaders from dragging their countries into stupid wars. And Kant seems to have had a point. A couple of political scientists have recently tested Kant's theory quantitatively against a data set of militarized disputes and have shown that he may seem to have gotten it right 3 out of 3 times, that all 3 of these factors have increased in the second half of the 20th century, and all of them, doing the right number crunching, are statistical predictors of peace down the line. Here we see that the number of democracies has been rising, the number of autocracies has fallen since their peak in the 70s. International trade has skyrocketed since the end of World War II. Intergovernmental organizations, the European Union, the United Nations, and so on, have been steadily increasing with an uptick after World War II. And another kind of international community, peacekeepers, soldiers with blue helmets who get themselves in between combatants, have increased especially since the 1990s. But there's a third theory that is more intensely psychological and more directly related to the film that we are going to see this evening. And that is that on top of these factors, there may have been a change in norms of what you simply do or don't even think about doing if you want to consider yourself to be a respectable member of a community. One of these norms that's been very much in the news recently is the territorial integrity norm. The idea that the international boundaries and member states of the United Nations are pretty much grandfathered in perpetuity. No matter how irrational the lines on a map are, even if they were drawn by some colonial officer after a drunken lunch in the 1920s, no matter what crazy collection of ethnic groups find themselves sharing a territory, you don't mess with the borders. In particular by force. States can fractionate and fall apart, but one state can't take over another. That concept has been called aggression, and it is formally outlawed, and in fact has hardly ever happened. According to one definition, it has not happened at all. There are exceptions that, in a sense, prove the rule. Israel took over 4 chunks of territory in 1967, has relinquished 2 of them, will probably relinquish most of the rest, and has been under constant pressure to do so, as if the boundaries of 1948 were somehow logical or eternal or cosmic, even though they're completely arbitrary borders. But because of the territorial integrity norm, that's what we agree to stick with. Argentina tried to mess with this norm in 1981, and Saddam Hussein in 1991. Britain and pretty much the entire world made short work of pushing them out, even though in the case of the Falklands, these are a bunch of islands that were hardly worth fighting over, other than to preserve the territorial norm. Now, of course, the reason that the territorial norm has been much in the news is because of the events of the last few weeks in Crimea, where Russia may or may not have flouted this norm, depending on how you factor in the fact that it was only given, Crimea was only given to Ukraine in 1954, and there was a kind of plebiscite, and human hypocrisy being what it is, there probably will be some bending of the definition precisely so that everyone can interpret what happened as not setting a precedent that flouts the no fiddling with boundaries norm. But then there's a second norm, and I promise this really does lead up to the film that we're going to see tonight, which is the anti-war norm, the idea that you just don't settle disputes with war anymore. Legally, we have a regime that has outlawed war. All the world's nations are signatories to an agreement that wars may only be fought either in self-defense or with the authorization of the Security Council. And more generally, people at least profess the idea that war is a horrific event to be avoided except as a last resort. However hypocritical in the practice, that is the aspiration. And this gets us back to Crimea, why I don't think that 100 years later we're going to have a reenactment of World War I over Crimea. Just to quote an American official, this is from a story in the New York Times a few days ago, quote, "The American people are not going to war with Russia over Ukraine, full stop," echoing public comments by Mr. Obama. Now, this may seem obvious, but we have to appreciate what a radical change this is from thousands of years of human history. That prior to World War I, which seems to have been something of a turning point, the dominant view was that war itself, forgetting the aims of war, forgetting how many lives you're supposed to save by a preventive war or making the world safe for democracy or whatever else, in the 19th century, people believed that war was valuable in and of itself. That war is, as John Mueller has put it, noble, uplifting, virtuous, glorious, heroic, exciting, manly, beautiful, holy, and thrilling. That peace is decadent, frivolous, consumerist, selfish, materialist, effeminate. Now, we all are snickering because this view seems to us today to be barking mad. That war is an activity that is designed to kill people and break things. How could any sane person actually think that war in and of itself is virtuous? Well, let me give you some quotes, and these are not from Prussian military aristocrats with their Pickelhauben. These are from quotes from some of our most refined philosophers, artists, and art appreciators. De Tocqueville, "War almost always enlarges the mind of a people and raises their character." Zola, "War is life itself. We must eat and be eaten so that the world might live. It is only warlike nations which have prospered. A nation dies as soon as it disarms." Art historian and critic John Ruskin, "When I tell you that war is the foundation of all the arts, I mean also that it is the foundation of all the high virtues and faculties of man." Hegel, "Wars are terrible but necessary, for they save the state from social petrifaction and stagnation." Nietzsche, "It is mere illusion and pretty sentiment to expect much, even anything at all from mankind if it forgets how to make war." Thomas Mann, "War is a purging and a liberation." Stravinsky, "War is necessary for human progress." So these weren't a few cranks or crackpots. This was the mainstream of cultivated, refined, educated elite opinion. My favorite, a quote from a British historian named John Cram, "Peace would mean a world sunk in bovine content." Now, I work in a building called William James Hall, named after the great philosopher and psychologist who in 1906 wrote a famous essay called The Moral Equivalent of War, which we are apt to think today must mean something that is as bad as war. But James, in fact, was trying to refer to something that would be as good as war. And he started off by writing a delicious little satire of the kind of romantic militarism that glorified war for its own sake. And here's how he characterized a position, which he in part accepted. "The horrors of war are a cheap price to pay for rescue from the only alternative supposed of a world of clerks and teachers, of co-education and zoophily, of consumers' leagues and associated charities, of industrialism unlimited and feminism unabashed. No scorn, no hardness, no valor anymore. Fie upon such a cattle yard of a planet." So while James made fun of this attitude, he also acknowledged a grain of truth in it, and he proposed a kind of early version of the Peace Corps and compulsory service where the youth would have their childishness knocked out of them by being forced to work in coal mines and factories and fishing boats and hospital kitchens and so on. And just to give you a couple of quotes, not from the 19th century, but just as the clouds of war were gathering over Europe in the anticipation of the possibility of World War I. You had Hilaire Belloc saying, "How I long for the Great War. It will sweep Europe like a broom." "I almost desire a monstrous war," from Paul Revelevi. And my favorite quote, "It will be a cold and bitter war, and a good many of us will wither before its blast, but it's God's own wind nonetheless, and a cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm has cleared," a quote from Sherlock Holmes. So everyone was getting in on the act. Well, they got what they asked for, the most horrific war in Europe up to that time, and this led to a fundamental change in attitudes toward war. World War I really was a turning point. Now, there were pacifists before World War I. Not everyone got swept up in the romantic militarism that said that war is holy and spiritual and manly and all that. Among them, Tolstoy, Hugo, Twain, Bertrand Russell, Carnegie, Nobel of Peace Prize fame, and George Bernard Shaw were all avowed pacifists. But it's hard to believe today that they were ridiculed in their time. H.G. Wells said on George Bernard Shaw at the outset of World War I that he was an elderly adolescent still at play. "All through the war we shall have the Shavian accompaniment going on like an idiot child screaming in a hospital." Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court Justice, is famous among other things for one of the few cases in which one is entitled. He argued to abrogate the First Amendment protection against free speech. He said there is no protection for shouting fire in a crowded theater. What was shouting fire in a crowded theater in his era? It was distributing pamphlets against the draft during World War I. And finally, Norman Angell was a British writer who wrote a pamphlet called The Great Illusion, the great illusion being that war was a way of enriching a country. And Angell argued that with the growth of interdependence and what we would today call globalism, it would be economically stupid to hope to get rich by conquering another country. That maybe it made sense for the Spaniards to try to invade South America to steal all the gold, but now that wealth came from networks of business and exchange, a country would not enrich itself by conquering another country. Now, he went down in history as a laughingstock for having made this argument in 1913 because people interpreted it as saying that war was obsolete. Whereas in fact, Angell said war could very well happen, just that war would be a disaster. He said war could easily happen because of nationalism and the quest for glory and honor, but if it did, it would be a catastrophe. And far from being wrong, of course, he was absolutely right. So after the war, because there had been a pre-war current of anti-war sentiment, the anti-war side could say, "I told you so." So the new attitude was that war is immoral, repulsive, uncivilized, futile, stupid, wasteful, absurd, unjust, and cruel. And this is an attitude that was ratified and encouraged in part by a huge wave of anti-war art. There were poets, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, T.S. Eliot in his poem The Hollow Men. But there was also a burgeoning genre of anti-war films that came not while World War I was being waged, because that would have been treason, but a decade or so later. The Big Parade, All Quiet on the Western Front, my favorite, Duck Soup, The Grand Illusion, the film by Renoir that was named after the pamphlet by Norman Angell. Then, of course, since not everyone was convinced that war was stupid, immoral, and so on, there was a period in which anti-war films had a bit of an eclipse. But perhaps beginning with Paths of Glory in 1957, there was a re-emergence of anti-war films, many of which continued to be set in World War I, which seemed to be, to everyone, to be the epitome of a stupid, inexplicable, pointless, immoral, wasteful war. King of Hearts, those of you who are nostalgic about the old Orson Welles Theatre and Central Square Theatre remember that this showed at midnight for years and years and years. Oh, What a Lovely War, Johnny Got His Gun, Gallipoli, and many others set in World War I. And that leads us to the film we're going to see this evening. paths of glory. It's interesting to, given this backdrop of how it was in the part of a movement to change norms about war from glorious, holy, manly, thrilling, spiritual, to disgusting, futile, stupid, absurd, cruel, how the various artists trying to hurry this norm change along accomplish their aims. And in watching the film, one can ask which of the better angels does Paths of Glory appeal? Does it appeal to the head, to the heart, to some combination? And I'll just throw out a couple of suggestions while being deliberately vague so that there won't be any spoiler alerts. I think it's pretty clear that Kubrick did appeal to our sense of empathy, our identification with the suffering of various protagonists. There is a focal individual, this will become clear as the film proceeds, whose anguish at being a victim of violence is palpable. There is one woman in the entire film, and traditionally in the literature on war, it's been treated as kind of a boys' game, something that where the winners are men and the victims are men, and almost the epitome of a war crime is violence against women and children, and the filmmaker's use of a single woman in the film is, I think, instructive. And no filmmaker is immune from the cheap trick of orchestrating audiences' sympathies through music, and we'll see how Kubrick uses a strategically placed bit of music to orchestrate our sympathies. But just as interesting, I think Kubrick and many of the anti-war films appeal to our rationality, our cognitive processes. And in particular, and I consider this to be a focal point of the film, is to highlight the difference between individual aggression, which indeed might be a challenge to eliminate given all the reasons that we might expect humans to be violent. But even if we bang our computer when we're frustrated at getting an error message, that's not enough to start a war. Remember the old bumper sticker, what if they gave a war and nobody came? It captures the idea that a war is not a matter of individual psychology, it's a matter of social organization. There have to be leaders who mobilize large numbers of people to try to accomplish something via aggression and assume individual risks in doing so, to subsume themselves as individuals under the goal of the collective. And that is an opening for questioning the rationality, desirability of war, and I think that is the opening that Kubrick exploits. Wars, of course, are decided by leaders, politicians, and officers, but they're fought by soldiers. It's the architects of war try to blur that distinction. They try to make it seem as if each soldier is representing the entire country, the entire society. In reality, they are being mobilized by leaders who do not have the same stakes, the same incentive structure. The incentives of leaders and the incentives of soldiers are very different, and that, you will see, is perhaps the major point of the film and the major way in which he gets audiences to think twice about what dying gloriously in war is all about. And finally, the empathy of an individual, the reason, figuring out what's going on of an individual, won't really affect social change unless they propagate throughout society and become changes in moral norms. Not things that you have to feel every time, that you have to think through every time, but the almost unconscious expectations of what you do and what you don't do. And by undermining the kind of moral rationales for war that were ubiquitous before World War I, the idea that war is noble, it's a form of altruism, self-sacrifice, courage, heroism, all these morally good things, by reframing war as something where what happens to the soldiers and what happens to the leaders are very different, then what happens to the soldiers doesn't seem so noble, altruistic, heroic, self-sacrificial, unselfish, and so on. The film repeatedly appeals to our sense of fairness, our outrage at what the soldiers undergo compared to what the leaders undergo, and by doing so, I think helped undermine the norm of war as something that is glorious. One more little bit of quantification. The very concept of glory, that it is admirable, desirable to prosecute a war, has been in long-term decline. This is from the Google Ngram viewer, showing that in English language books, the number of books that even have the word glory has been in free fall, and that I think this is part of the larger complex in which the kind of moral norm that rationalizes and moralizes war has been eroding. And as a final note, in support of the idea that this deliberate undermining of glory is one of Kubrick's intents in making this film, we can appeal to its very title. Where does the phrase "paths of glory" come from? It comes from Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, which contains the lines, "The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, all that beauty, all that welfare gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave." I think this is a wonderful epigraph for the film that we were about to see, and it illustrates Kubrick's deliberate attempt to undermine the moral norm of war as something glorious. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed the film. Thank you.